Good afternoon, and welcome to the Economy and Future of Work stage at Cognition X. I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing you to the next session, which is on what's coming next, economics in the age of COVID-19. And if you would like to tweet any of the contents of that session, I would encourage you to tweet at CogX 2020 or tweet to the sponsor Institute for the Future of Work at @_future of work. You can also pose questions to all of the panelists by going into your CogX online app and asking questions there. I'm now delighted to hand over to Matthew, who will be the moderator for this session.
Miasha, thank you very much indeed, and a very warm welcome to you wherever you are in the world. I know lots of you are spread far and wide. It's great to have you with us for this CogX event. CogX, as you know, in 2020 is exploring the question of how do we get the next 10 years right? And that is a more challenging question in the face of this pandemic than it might otherwise have been. My name is Matt Stadlen. I'm a presenter on the national radio station LBC. It stands for Leading Britain's Conversation. And today we really are leading a global conversation together here at CogX. We prefer, of course, to be on a physical stage, but this is the next best thing. And I'm grateful to you, as I say, for joining. The specific question we're going to ask over the course of the next hour, and you'll be, I hope, participants, not just listeners. You'll be able to ask your own questions as part of the audience Q&A in the second half of this hour. But the question we're going to be negotiating, wrestling with our panel is recovery. What's coming next? Economics in the age of COVID-19. There is huge uncertainty, of course, for all of us. And there is an extent to which we are all in this together. Although, of course, there is a very great extent as well to which we are not equal, and we will explore that question shortly as well. Professor Joshua Gans, he's at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. He's the chief economist of the Creative Destruction Lab. More on that a little later on. Margaret Heffernan, for her part, she's an entrepreneur, she's the CEO, she's a writer, she's a keynote speaker, and she's a champion of women in business. Tera Allas is director of research and economics at McKinsey and Co. And a very warm welcome to each of you. This is an important question, but it's also a very wide-ranging question. You each bring different expertise to the equation. I would like to start, if I may, with Margaret. Margaret Heffernan, just how challenging do you think this pandemic will prove, not just in the short term to employment and to economics more generally, but in the medium and longer terms?
Well, I think the pandemic is obviously going to be seen as a fundamental turning point. I think, you know, in my own mind, it's the moment we finally entered the 21st century and accepted that ineradicable uncertainty is a defining characteristic of the world we live in, of the economy that we contribute to, and of the companies that we work in or for. And I think, you know, my observation of organizations and businesses is that they've tried very hard for the last 20 years to ignore that and to cleave to the good old-fashioned principles of efficiency, that we've done cost cutting because it's what we're really good at, much more than we've been successful at doing value building, and that we are now really kind of getting our comeuppance in terms of having to deal and work in an environment and create work in an environment where all sorts of things like pandemics and bank crashes and climate change are generally certain, but specifically ambiguous, which is to say we don't quite know when they're going to happen. We can't say exactly the details according to which they'll happen, but we know that they are characteristics or contours of the space in which we're all going to need to operate. So this really is quite new. And I know, you know, that there's a whole fad for saying everything is new. I think this is new in the sense that I think we now can't run away from it anymore. And it puts huge pressure on governments and organizations of all kinds to start thinking about what work should people be doing? What work do people want to be doing? What does it look like? And what are its defining characteristics? And those are very, very different questions from the questions that we have been asking, which is how much can we do using as few people as possible, with as few errors as possible, with all of the kind of tools of scientific management. I think those really go out the window right now. I'm not going to make predictions about the future of work. I think it's more important to think about two things. One is to think about what kind of work has meaning in this new context. And the second is to think about really what it is, how it is that people can make good decisions, leaders can make good decisions in this context. What kind of work are people doing that builds an economy? Well, it has to do two things. It has to create value, and it also has to be relevant. So that means both socially and culturally relevant. In other words, it has to mean something, and it has to be socially, culturally acceptable. What that means is that the picture that many commentators have painted, where you just throw out all the people and replace them with robots, is neither technically practical nor socially valid, which is to say that it won't be socially acceptable to do that, however divine a fantasy it may seem to some managers. So work is going to have to use technology judiciously to do work that's complicated, repeatable, but that doesn't involve human judgment. And humans are going to be crucial for making judgments that the world in which they live can find acceptable and explicable. So I think outsourcing, decision making to machines is going to prove a very fragile way of going forward. I think participation is going to be a key note of this world of work, in the sense that people are more inclined to support what they've participated in. That's going to put a huge pressure on leaders of all kinds to think about, how do I convene the brightest minds that I have to inform and educate organizations about where we're going and why we're going there. And I think, we have to recognize that nobody's prepared for this. Nobody knows how to run an organization or a country through a climate crisis. Nobody obviously knows how to do it through a pandemic. But if we can get efficiency out of our heads and start thinking instead about robustness, start thinking about having more creativity than we need, having more talent than we need, having more educated workforce than we absolutely have to have. In other words, having lashings of the creativity, imagination, education that the future will require, I think we stand a pretty good chance of navigating the future pretty well. I think if we cling to the old doctrines of efficiency, we're really going to be in deep trouble.
So I want to bring the professor in. Joshua Gans, one of the words that Margaret used was uncertainty. Now, great things, as we know, can emerge from times of flux. Human beings can be at their most creative and inventive. But stepping back for a moment, how resilient tend to be economics, tend to be our financial structures in times of great uncertainty? How damaging is that uncertainty?
Well, I think Margaret is right that this is an event that is a wake-up call, although we've had similar ones in the past, and we react to it in varying manners. The one thing that I think is interesting about the pandemic itself is that there actually have been some people and countries who have had a plan. I think, broadly speaking, that the pandemic is an information problem. This is the sort of information problem that financial markets often have to deal with. But it's an information problem in that it is caused by the fact that we don't know who's infected. Because if we knew know who was infected, we'd be able to deal with it, isolate and manage the pandemic. Countries did that with SARS and with MERS previously. Those pandemics could have blown up into something big, only lasted a couple of months. And there are countries around the world, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, Iceland, Mongolia, who have all been able to deal with the current pandemic in much the same way. So there is actual things that you can do. And those have in common the experience of having done them before. For the most part, the countries that have dealt with this well have had experience in managing pandemics before. The countries that have done it poorly, North America, much of Europe, etc., have not. And so in that score, I'm a little bit more optimistic than Margaret in the sense that I see that, at least with regard to pandemics, there's a way of managing things. But broadly speaking, the key word, I think, is resilience, is that markets tend to not place a high enough value on things into the future. They purport to it. They purport to the values of the companies we see, a measure of their long-term value. But let's face it, 1 month ago, many of those companies were, according to the markets, 40% lower valued than they are this month, and then half as much before. That doesn't give you confidence that anyone is doing anything in terms of resilience in which we would expect to see something smoother. So I think that's going to come to play, and it wouldn't surprise me if markets in the future demand that corporations have a plan for some of these things, and maybe all of them.
Thank you. And Tera, Allas, Director of Research and Economics at McKinsey. I wonder what you have learned from the research you've been doing during this pandemic into work, into employment, and how much scope for optimism that's allowed you.
So it's interesting that both Margaret and Josh have spoken about some of the kind of trade-offs that we're facing, whether it's efficiency versus robustness or resilience, whether it's kind of certainty versus uncertainty. I think one first thing to note is that there has been a lot of talk about all these trade-offs as we've been through the pandemic. It's whether we need to save lives or we need to save the economy, whether we need to save the planet or we need to get the economy going again. And one of the things we found is that actually working at that kind of high level of kind of very high level concepts isn't very helpful at all. So you need to kind of dig deeper into the granularity of what's actually happening to individual businesses, individual people, and individual countries and so on. So when you do that, you actually find that there are some big trade-offs, and I'll come on to say a bit about jobs in a minute, but also there are a lot of win-wins. Like, 50% of all the carbon reduction activity that we can imagine right now is actually positive net present value. So it would be interesting to understand why the market is not actually financing it and not pushing for it. In terms of basically the ways in which we can get people back to work, one of the key things that we probably will need to invest in is around skills. And investing in skills is pretty much a win-win for the employer, for the government, for the individual themselves. And so, there are a lot of win-win opportunities out there. The real challenge, we think, is going to be around making this equitable. So it's fairly easy to imagine, let's say, fiscal stimulus, fiscal investment by a lot of governments being steered towards more green and creating a lot of jobs. But 80%, 85% of all people who would benefit from that are men. So what are we going to do to create jobs for women would be my question to that. Similarly, ethnic minorities are harder hit right now because of furloughs and job losses. Not as badly in the UK as they are in the US, but nevertheless slightly harder hit. And how are we going to make sure that any job creation scheme, any support scheme, any fiscal stimulus is actually reducing inequalities rather than increasing them further? Lots of discussion around investment in infrastructure, in broadband, how people are now going to work from home. Well, guess what? 60% of people in the workforce cannot work from home under any circumstances. If you're a nurse, you cannot work from home. If you're a bus driver, you cannot work from home. If you're a retail assistant, you cannot work from home. So I think we all need to better understand what the actual world looks like, not what our theories about the world look like. And my final point here is going to be that I think leadership, both in businesses and in government, will need to come to grips with the kind of complexity and ambiguity that Margaret's talking about to really make a difference. And that means stopping thinking of people as cogs in a machine that react and respond to incentives and commands, and thinking about people as a much more multifaceted, much less predictable set of, organisms, really, that need to be influenced in a very different way and in a much more subtle way.
Margaret, I want to ask you two questions, really, wrapped up into one, perhaps. So Joshua cast himself as a little more optimistic than you. Would you cast your own views, your own position on the post-COVID economy as pessimistic or not? And just to pick up on what Tera was saying just then, it raised an important point about equality and huge issues of how we work together, how collaborative we are, the extent to which we are or are not in this together have been raised by the pandemic. You've written, amongst several books, a book called Women on Top. How worried should we be about issues of inequality, such as the ones that Tera raised just then?
Well, I am an optimist, not least because optimists tend to live longer and have better lives and to be healthier and generally to get more out of life. So I think there's a kind of moral imperative to optimism. And I think it's simply a better and more productive and creative lens through which to experience life. I think the question of equity that Tera mentioned is absolutely fundamental, because it's really important to recognize the market is not the economy. The economy is the combination of everything that people are doing and could be doing within a society. Some of that's captured by the market. Some of it's captured by economic measures like GDP. There is no particular measure that captures all of it. So we have to think much further than the market or GDP or things like that. And when you start looking through the lens of equity, you start seeing a much bigger world than either of those kind of partial representations. It's certainly the case. I mean, the book I wrote, Women on Top, looked at the fact that at the time, I think about 48% of privately held businesses in the US were owned and run by women, and that they tended to be more profitable, they lasted longer, and then they created more jobs. And I was simply flabbergasted by the fact that nobody was paying attention to this uniquely successful cohort of over 10 million businesses. So I was very interested in what they're doing. It's certainly the case here in the UK that if we had the level of female entrepreneurship that the United States enjoys, our economy would absolutely be transformed. And if you take that same lens to look at Black and ethnic minorities and their involvement in entrepreneurship, you would see the same thing. Now, I don't believe for a moment that all of the economy is entrepreneurship either, but I do think it's a sign of resilience in terms of people's sense of agency and creativity and their capacity to make a world and to make work for themselves. So I think equity is really fundamental, not least because one of the things we are seeing around the world is that to the degree that people feel that they cannot participate in the world on an equitable basis, they have absolutely no vested interest in supporting it and every motive for upending it. And we have to start taking this very much more seriously than we have in the past. We've seen a lot of bluster, a lot of kind of abstract statements and marvelous pieces of research about equity. We have seen very precious little action. So I think equity is essential because actually, many of the big missteps that we have been making in businesses and organizational lives have been because the quality of discussion hasn't been representative enough, and because the people who need to be representative have not been allowed to participate or to participate at an appropriate level. And at the very least, this represents a phenomenal level of waste, a waste of talent, human capital, social capital, human capacity. And when I think about the challenges we're going to face in the next 10 years, we can't afford this level of waste. We need everybody. We need every kind of thinking, every kind of participation, and we need people to feel that they are in it together in a way that the pandemic has revealed that they really aren't.
Professor Gans, the topic today is recovery. What's coming next? But in order to know what's coming next, we kind of have to get through the current crisis. So I just briefly want to bring us back to the pandemic. First of all, how resilient do you feel Western economies have been so far in the past 3 or 4 months? Has it surprised you that we've adapted relatively well, or are you concerned by our reaction? And also, is there a massive gap, do you think, between the productivity that we can expect from our economies over the course of the next decade, let's say, between a world in which we do have a vaccine and a world in which we don't?
So I think this is an area where the teachings of Margaret regarding uncertainty have really come to play. We have some idea to deal on the health side with what to do with a pandemic. We had absolutely no idea or playbook of how to deal with it on the economic side. And that's all the way to the top, all the way to the bottom, every single decision maker in that round. Now, a bit of a miracle occurred where, at least amongst economists and then to policymakers, there was a quick jump to, I suggest, the right sort of band-aid and philosophy in terms of making sure that what we did today or during the pandemic, during the lockdown, created the best chance for just being able to start up again. Now, that was partly predicated on it not being too long, a thing. But you see in the employment numbers in the United States, some of that plan going ahead. There was a large amount of unemployment, but part of that was a bit of accounting because people could, as soon as the economies reopened, walk back into their current jobs. So those statistics were telling nothing about this. But we have to remember this is completely on the fly. This is completely on the fly. We do not know so much about this management of this current pandemic and how long it's going to last, let alone what the mess will look like at the end that may or may not be cleaning up. And I think we should be wary of it. We should be concerned about it. I don't think it's in one of those situations where we can sort of come back and say, we should have done something different. I think we're still doing and did the right thing. But there is a lot of work to be done in that regard. I think we're also going to learn, and just to tie it back regarding equity, is part of the reason that we didn't have a plan was because we had to go on the fly, because we didn't structure our economies to have automatic means of allowing people to go home, do the right thing, and then come back to work. We didn't have automatic payments for that. Unemployment insurance was inadequate. We had no government schemes for having businesses run. We had no policy with regard to housing, which is a critical thing in all of that. Different countries have handled that differently. And when the dust settles, we'll be able to see which was the right way to go. But truth be told, no one should have had to pass legislation for this. It should have just kicked in some way. And that's the problem. And part of the problem with that is that we haven't dealt with some of the inequality problems on many dimensions. This is a side effect of that.
Tera, you are Director of Research and Economics at McKinsey. McKinsey is arguably the most respected consultancy in the world. You are constantly offering your advice to decision makers. And I wonder whether you feel that the decisions that we make now are absolutely critical to how successful or otherwise our economies can be in the coming years. Or do you subscribe to the idea, despite doing what you do for a living, that somehow human beings kind of muddle through, and the pieces of the jigsaw that have been thrown and scattered into the air at the moment will fall in roughly the right positions in due course, regardless of the decisions that are being made?
So that's a really interesting question. Of course, the answer is going to be it's not black or white. What Margaret said about the economy not being just the markets is absolutely correct. Markets left to their own devices will not get to the right answer. What Josh said about equity is also right. You know, politically, politicians have not been able to orchestrate the sort of redistribution that economists also always assume is going to be there. Like, 101 economics teaches you that you want to maximize the pie. And as long as you redistribute the pie then equitably, everybody's better off. Well, guess what? A, we never do redistribute the pie equitably or effectively and efficiently. And B, you cannot redistribute mental health. You cannot redistribute a lot of the things that people actually fundamentally care more about than just money. You know, status, a sense of belonging, agency was a word that Margaret used. So I think, economists and politicians and everybody needs to get much more thoughtful about how we even think about these issues. They're more complex than just some formulae. In terms of decision making right now, I'm an optimist as well, but I'm in the kind of realistic optimist camp. So I think we'll muddle through. I don't see an awful lot of decisions that are being made right now that are super irreversible. And so as long as that is the case, we'll be kind of fine. It's more like Margaret was saying, like there's a big upside opportunity we will miss if we don't use the recovery and coming back to economic activity as a way to kind of pivot towards the future. And if we were to use it as an opportunity, then maybe we could use all of the money and the effort and the time that goes into devising the recovery schemes and whatever, to actually thinking about, well, what is the future we want for ourselves and for our children? And can we make absolutely sure that every policy and every action we take, either as a business or as a government, is aligned with that future? For a lot of business leaders, I think this is the time to take a step back and not just think about, well, it's a schizophrenic time, because on one hand, you have to be very, very focused on things like cash flow just to stay in business. But on the other hand, you want to be thinking about those same kinds of things, and you want to be thinking about, on a human level, what are you doing with your people to make sure that this recovery is sustainable for them as well.
Margaret, let me finish with you before we move to the audience Q&A. And I want to pick up on something you talked about earlier, which is climate change and the looming climate catastrophe, or at the very least climate challenge. And I wonder whether you feel that this experience of COVID-19 has taught us something very, very important, that we are not invulnerable, that we are fragile as a species, and our world can be turned upside down overnight. Do you think that will inform and help our fight against climate change? And also, I'm only going to give you a minute because we're running out of time. And we'll spill over later into the Q&A. You can answer it more fully then. But also, as part of that question, do you think change that is required in fighting climate change and re-establishing our economies post-COVID, do you think that will be more dominated from the top down or from the bottom up?
So I think it's a great question. I think that if we pay attention, we can learn a lot about how to deal with the climate crisis from this crisis. And one of the things we've learned about this crisis is that we could have prepared for it. You can't plan for things that are as ambiguous as an epidemic, but you can prepare for it. You can think about what are all the things that we know when it hits, we will want to have plenty of. We could have done that. Some countries did do that. We chose not to do it. The United States specifically chose not to do it. So the concept of preparedness, I think, is really germane and central here, which is we can see this coming. We don't know which forests are going to catch fire, which parts of the countryside are going to flood, but we know this stuff is going to happen, and we could start preparing generously for those events, because one way or the other, they are going to unfold. I think the other thing is we have a choice. And it strikes me, although I'm very reluctant to adopt war analogies, it strikes me it's a little bit like, the way we dealt with the end of the First World War, kind of a big punishment and muddle through and business as usual, versus the way we dealt with the Second World War, which is, hang on a second, business as usual didn't serve us well last time. We need something much more forceful and much more assertive in terms of building institutions and preparedness on a scale and in a joined up way that will give all of us resilience. I think that's the kind of leadership people are looking for. I think it's the kind of thinking we can and should be doing now with the epidemic very much at the forefront of our minds. But I think that the gravitational pull to the norm is huge. It's why we've done absolutely, almost nothing in the last 30 years to address climate change. And if we go into climate change thinking we can plan our response efficiently, we've lost the plot completely. We have to start thinking about robustness, resilience. We need to think about adaptation. And this cannot be top down because it's too complex. It has to be both. It has to be everybody doing everything they can think of. That's how you deal with an existential threat, which clearly climate change is.
Very interesting indeed. Margaret Heffernan, thank you. Professor Joshua Gans, thank you as well. And Tera, Allas, last but not least, of course, thank you to you too. Now is the moment when you get to ask your questions, the questions you feel very strongly I should have asked but didn't. We'll have a couple of minute break while we aggregate those questions in the audience Q&A, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.